So I've put together a few slides to provide you with an overview of a research project that we did for the British Council for Offices last year. So as you can see, the report was released back in December 2022, delivering net zero carbon in the workplace. So the background to this is the BCO were quite keen to have a better understanding of the drivers for net zero, the opportunities that lie ahead, but also the challenges that building owners and occupiers are facing in the real estate sector. And they asked us to do a piece of research for them. So we deployed qualitative research methods, surveys and interviews, but also we looked into a few case studies for them, again, to identify the trends. So the research was led by an academic team at IEDE, as you can see, and Ryan Ashari from UCL Institute, and now I understand that Verco also made significant contribution to the project. So a little bit of context. As you're aware, ever since the introduction of the framework definition for net zero by the UK GBC, we have seen the introduction of several guidance documents and indeed net zero carbon targets by professional basically organizations, but also grassroots movements such as Low Energy Transformation Initiative. We have targets in different shapes and forms in terms of operational energy or carbon and embodied carbon. It's quite important to have an understanding of the context, whether or not we are dealing with base building, the tenant space in the context of commercial real estate sector or whole building, or when it comes to embodied carbon, whether we are talking about whole life carbon emissions or the upfront carbon and so on and so forth. So that explains discrepancies in the numbers that we can see, but also the underlying assumptions in different documents. So a little bit of standardization actually quite helps. This was one of the key emerging messages from our survey and interviews. And I understand Julie actually will give us a presentation about the latest developments in terms of net zero carbon standard later today. So this is just one example from RABA 2030 Climate Challenge documents where we would like to be ideally by 2030, and we have interim targets for 2025. Given the long lead time in terms of building procurement in the real estate sector, we really need to start now. So the idea was to look into a few projects also, but also get feedback from building practitioners and building users to have a better understanding of where the industry is at the moment. So in terms of our survey, a little bit of stats and background. So we managed to get feedback from around 100 building users and building practitioners. So it's not a very large sample. At the same time, it's a decent size, but also the quality of feedback and the insightful comments that we received are quite helpful. So as you can see, it's very much based on London and Southeast, but we have, again, a good representation from various regions in the UK and also organizations that have international presence. Again, dominated by large enterprises, especially when it comes to building users, but a good representation of small and medium enterprises, and a very good coverage in terms of providing a cross-section of different disciplines involved in building procurement, in addition to building users. So it's, I think it's quite good in trying to capture the feedback of different disciplines, and that's probably one of the key strengths of this survey. So in terms of the key outputs and highlights, and we have provided the full detail in the BCO report, of course. In terms of the existing industry framework and standards that are being used by building users and practitioners, as you can see, and as you would expect, the UK GBC net zero framework and guidance is quite dominant there. Then we have LETI Climate Emergency Design Guide, Neighbours UK in the context of the commercial sector, the real estate sector, again, quite important in shaping the debate about net zero. BREEAM, interestingly enough, of course, is not strictly speaking a net zero, if you like, standard, like Neighbours really, but these are shaping the debate. Neighbours as a holistic sustainability rating scheme is actually quite well established in this country, especially when it comes to material, not only operational carbon, but when it comes to material, it's still a very good reference point in the ongoing debate about net zero. But you can see various other guidelines and really emerging standards and rating schemes that have been cited by people in the industry and their influence. A very interesting outcome of this survey, and you can see it here in terms of people's perception about how they are doing in terms of achieving net zero operational targets. But you can see the same discrepancy across the board, actually, in the response to other questions as well. So respondents' view of their organization's effort and indeed success in achieving net zero targets is much more positive compared to the wider building sector. So it's a very interesting bias. Probably they feel quite empowered, and they think that they would be able to make effective changes, in their ongoing projects. For example, speaking of design professionals, they are less convinced about what's going on in the wider building sector, probably as a result of, and again, this was an emerging theme, lack of mandatory requirements in the building industry in terms of achieving net zero, but also the system of incentives that are not quite there, not quite sufficient to enable us to achieve the critical mass required for transition to net zero. Most respondents believe that green leases could be quite important in the context of the real estate sector in managing the relationship between building owners and building users, tenants, to define contractual arrangements requirement to shape sustainability objectives together and indeed to achieve net zero carbon targets in this context. Having said that, there are some reservations regarding the existing contractual arrangements, lack of empirical data basically to enable us to define limits and indeed targets and benchmarks, especially when it comes to tenant space, the base building and tenant space. The neighbors scheme is trying to address that problem to a certain extent. It's still a very niche part of the real estate sector, the adoption of neighbors. But there's some way to go basically to overcome these challenges. But at the same time, some people believe that we really need to mandate for green leases and this type of prescriptive limits and targets for net zero, both in the context of embodied carbon and operational carbon. So you can see both ends of the spectrum. An interesting finding here is people's view of the role of ESG commitments in the context of net zero. As you can see, there's a huge gap there. It's quite interesting because this is not feedback from general public. This is a feedback from building practitioners and building users, people in charge of shaping ESG objectives or delivering ESG objectives and commitments. And they believe that we are not quite there, primarily because we don't have robust auditing and verification protocols and mechanisms to make sure that we are delivering on these commitments. So, to put it simply, we are talking the talk, but whether or not we are delivering on these commitments is a huge question mark out there, again, posed by practitioners and building users. We followed that survey with a number of semi-structured interviews, I think 13 interviews to be precise, with developers, building users, and also building designers, architects, and MEP engineers, and portfolio managers or asset managers, if you like. So what I have done here, I have extracted some quotes from the interviews, really to set the scene for the events today, to provide you with some food for thought and also hopefully discussions throughout the day as part of the presentations and the panel discussion that we're going to have. So in terms of the net zero strategies, and this is where you can see perhaps the impact of larger organizations, occupier organizations here. They are now trying to develop their strategies around decarbonizing their organizations and achieving net zero targets across their organizations. As you can see, they are more focused on the so-called scope 3 emissions in the context of the greenhouse gas emissions protocol. And typically, when it comes to energy use at building level, even in the middle of the energy crisis, and this is Q4 of last year, this interview, does not constitute a big chunk of their greenhouse gas emission. As a result of that, they don't give necessarily priority to buildings compared to, if you like, their scope 3 emissions, in relative terms, of course. And also, they are trying to use science-based targets to basically inform their ongoing strategies and initiatives to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And it's not that easy for them to relate their science-based targets in terms of greenhouse gas emissions to the energy use intensity targets that we use in the context of RABA, climate emergency, LETI design guides, and so on and so forth. So there's a little bit of gap there that really practitioners and indeed academics hopefully would be able to fill in. And in terms of the real estate sector, they really believe that we need more frameworks and also policy instruments to really encourage tenants and to push basically the energy side at building level. We are not quite there. Again, you can see this divergence between science-based targets and what we are trying to do at building level. So just to give you an example, so at building level, we always try to follow this environmental design hierarchy. Well, not necessarily always, there are some exceptions I'll come to, but at least in the context of new build and major renovation, to start from passive measures to reduce building demand and maximize the supply side, working on building services strategy, and then specify low or zero carbon technologies. Looking through the spectrum of greenhouse gas emissions, science-based targets, it's much easier for these organizations, speaking of building users, major occupiers, to, for example, focus on green power purchase, to go for another procurement contract, in more favorable procurement contract cost-wise, and also, again, work on the scope 3 emissions and carbon offsetting schemes. Whereas, again, when it comes to building level, we would like to start from demand and not necessarily green power supply or purchase at that stage. So you can see this, if you like, dilemma and interesting dynamics here going on at organizational level compared with building level. So the use of CREM tool, carbon risk in real estate monitor tool, is quite basically common these days among asset managers, but also increasingly building designers. It's again not easy to apply this in the context of commercial real estate sector, for example, in terms of disaggregation of energy between the base built and tenant space. And there was a feedback from one of the interviewees that we would not be able to basically apportion this and apply it to the tenant space that easily. So these are the type of challenges that we have in this context. So moving on from operational energy and carbon, when it comes to embodied carbon, we are dealing with higher uncertainty and different issues, especially the lack of EPDs, environmental product declaration, when it comes to building services. So there's a big challenge there. And I know that CIFSI Technical Memorandum 65 is trying to basically respond to that challenge in the absence of widespread EPDs for building services, using their basic and basically mid-level approaches to quantify and to estimate basically the embodied carbon of building services. But this is still a big unknown for specifier of these systems and for building services designers. And that was a strong, if you like, message and emerging theme from our interviews. In terms of managing existing buildings, and then I go through retrofitting existing buildings. So in terms of managing existing buildings, the overarching message is, yes, there's an understanding that post-pandemic, we are not dealing with buildings at full occupancy as we are experiencing right now, actually. So we really need first to have a compelling case to convince our staff to come back to their offices. That's the first thing. But at the interim, in the meantime, we really need to be responsive to this, if you like, partial occupancy mode in terms of demand control strategies or building services strategies to make sure that we can optimize performance. And there's a significant gap when it comes to managing existing buildings on that front, and a huge opportunity. In terms of, again, managing existing buildings, actually people are really looking forward to work with the new Green Lease Toolkit. So as you know, this was originally released back in 2013. Better Buildings Partnership are now working on the new toolkit, and the idea is again to have more specific targets for the base building, for the tenant space, to inform the green leases and also to encourage data sharing between the landlords and occupiers. So this is probably that could be a major development in the context of the real estate sector. And also we are trying increasingly to, yes, to embrace design for performance. So we moved from design for compliance, which we suffered for several years, to design for performance, but now we have begun to talk about manage for performance. And that is quite important, you know, this integrated approach to designing and managing for performance. And there are different initiatives such as MAP, Managing Agents Partnership, that could be framed under management for performance, if you like, mindset and framework. In terms of building retrofits, and again, speaking of existing buildings, of course, that's our main target. in decarbonization. There are two different issues here, or two different angles. One is financing of basically retrofit measures. Who is going to pay for it in the end? How we can basically share and apportion, the payment between the owner and occupiers, and what if somebody wants to pull out from the lease agreement, and how we would be able to define that that rebate mechanism within the existing contractual arrangement, or indeed green leases. There's a big debate going on around that. But also technically, going back to my supposedly sound environmental design hierarchy, when you're dealing with an existing building with a facade system that has another 50, 20 years to go, it's not that easy to start from passive measures. You would be able to do some minor improvements, yes, but probably if you adopt a holistic approach to embodied carbon or operational carbon, it does make sense to keep the existing facade system for now, focus on building services strategy, and through the CREM tool, for example, plan for a refurbishment cycle 10, 15, 20 years down the line. So that integrated approach and holistic approach to both embodied and operational carbon is also quite important, and it was one of the key emerging themes through our interviews. The other thing when it came to fit out was this conflict between Cat A and Cat B fit outs, in which developers would like to come up with category A fit out and pass it on to building users. When it comes to large occupiers specifically, they are quite keen to have their own bespoke fit out. So very often they rip out all services and come up with their own fit out. There's a lot of waste in terms of embodied carbon, of course, involved in this process. From a developer's point of view, this may not be a significant issue statistically, as you can see here, and they're quite positive that they would be able to come up with durable and robust solutions that are sustainable. Having said that, from occupiers' perspective, and also specifically design practitioners, that was a strong emerging and recurring, if you like, issue and theme through our interviews. Building users and also increasingly designers, architects, for example, are focusing on the EPDs, and again, the lack of EPDs, not only in terms of fabric, of course, we are more advanced there, mainly building services, but also building furniture when it comes to fit out is a significant issue. Lack of mandatory requirements for EPDs, despite the fact that organizations are increasingly trying to include for these in their specification. But again, we don't have sufficient information and data as things stand right now. I don't go through the case studies in detail, but just a couple of observations. So we have 3 case studies in the report. In terms of operational carbon, you can see increasing reliance on electrification of building services and moving towards heat pumps, of course. So that's the trend. In the context of existing buildings, that will come with its own challenges, again, in the absence of necessarily attention to passive measures in terms of building envelopes. So might be some knock-on effect there. In terms of embodied carbon, again, increasing interest in reducing the concrete and steel content, improving the use of cross-laminated timber, glue lamp, generally identifying opportunities for carbon sequestration. So good evidence through these case studies. But importantly, all these case studies represent still design projects. It's a big question, what happens in practice? And through one of these projects, the Paradise project, I've already seen the change in specification in terms of embodied carbon and some compromises down the line. So again, speaking of that issue with regards to ESG commitments, a robust measurement and verification framework is really necessary to make sure we achieve these targets in practice. And there are very few projects that are now able to produce these results out there. So we are not quite there, although it's quite impressive so far as design measures are concerned. So very briefly, in terms of implications for the real estate, 2 key stats from our survey. Only 12% of the business respondents took the view that commitments to net zero operational carbon are being achieved in building sector. And when it came to basically embodied carbon, 60% thought that more needs to be done. So there's a high uncertainty when it comes to embodied carbon, and we really need to address that issue. They also issued a strong call for a more proactive approach from the governments in terms of mandatory requirements and also existing financial incentives, VAT, for example, exemptions for refurbishments and so on and so forth. But from our side, both practitioners, but also academics, there's more work to be done in terms of development of empirical evidence that could help building owners and occupiers better procure and manage their buildings. Improved green leases, pre-lets, and longer leases are perceived to be quite helpful because you get the chance to collaborate, with building user as a developer to agree on the common objectives. Having said that, interestingly, post-pandemic, can see a trend towards greater flexibility and shorter leases. So again, that's a very interesting challenge and dynamics. How to make sure that we have the right leasing arrangements in the contract to have the flexibility, yes, but at the same time to achieve the environmental objectives. Again, the issue with the energy use intensity, especially in the context of commercial real estate sector, separation of base building and tenant space, that's a big debate that is going on. And again, we need more empirical evidence. One of the key challenges in existing buildings that is related to the previous basically item is existing metering strategies. And we are not quite able now to disaggregate, energy between these areas, landlord and tenant space. Again, neighbors projects are quite interesting to follow and see whether or not in due course we can develop the empirical baseline for this or not. In the context of embodied carbon, the use of locally sourced material with lower embodied carbon, of course, needs to be encouraged. We need to have verified EPDs in place, but also a major cultural shift is required really to go through this type of low carbon, for example, furniture, because when it comes to larger organizations, for example, they still are under impression that there's an expectation from the staff, but also more so from their clients to have this type of shiny, brand new equipment. So we are not quite there also in terms of perception and acceptance of people, to try and increase our recycled content. Last but not least, again, speaking of building services, this is something that in the context of embodied carbon, we really need to push for. As things stand, there are very few EPDs around, but again, Symposium 65 was a welcome move basically to address this challenge. But we really need to make sure that this is increasingly asked for when it comes to consultation and discussions with system suppliers, at least if they can provide a bill of material in terms of the composition of material of building services, given that the large part of the embodied carbon of building services is related to the material extraction process, we would be able to have an estimation using the basic or mid-level approaches defined under Symposium 65 until the time that we have widespread use of EPDs in the industry. And that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
So you really covered a lot there. And I have to say, I think some of the graphs we produce, I think they really visualize the scale of the challenge. So I'm aware that we're running a little bit late, but I think we have time to take maybe a couple of questions from the audience. So we have a microphone here. Thanks. So are there any questions for Esfand? Of course, there'll be opportunities for further discussion during the panel session.
I know you don't have any estate agents in your sample, but you did have some. So did you notice differences in their views of what's happening?
Estate agents, not in the interviews, but in the surveys, yes, they were basically represented. I think they are more optimistic regarding ESG objectives. But interestingly enough, when it came to our discussions with designers specifically, they were quite critical of the role of state agents in the markets. So they were not quite convinced that they are doing their task to make sure that these sustainability objectives and indeed targets are part of an ongoing discussion between landlord and occupiers. So that's that perspective, but also, of course, through that managing agents partnership, at least large organizations are trying to address that. So a lot needs to be done in terms of training. This was something that was coming out quite strongly, not from agents themselves, from other stakeholders. So it's very interesting you basically focus on that, because again, there was a lot of basic finger pointing going on when it comes to state agents. People at least perceive that there's a gap there in terms of education, but in terms of also strong ESG commitments.
Is there another question for us? Yes, please.
So I'm trying to reconcile three graphics. One was the industry indicating that they are doing a good job individually, yes, on how they're addressing problems. To the second one, which shows that there's a view that generally or overall industry is not doing enough. And then the third one, which is an ESG, generally there's a real dissatisfaction.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to reconcile is whether there's some motivation in every, if every member of the survey feels that they're doing an above average job of addressing climate concerns here, are they motivated to actually make changes, or do they think it's the next guy's problem or woman's problem to find a solution?
That's a very good question. Again, I'm not sure I have a ready answer for that, but my impression was when it came to especially practitioners who are involved in projects that basically are trying to achieve net zero targets, as I said, they believe that they are in a position to make changes. So for that reason, they are quite optimistic. But having said that, within the same organization, when it comes to achieving that organization ESG objective, they might have a different view. So as a building services designer, for example, I might be quite optimistic about my impact on my ongoing project, but that's separate from the ESG objectives within my own organization. So I think that's a subtle difference that might have something to do with, this different dynamics that you highlighted. And that's a very valid question and comment.
Great, thank you so much, Esfand.
Thank you.